Welcome back, my name's Joe.
And I'm Aiden.
And this is the Filmosophy discussion where we take a movie and analyze it using different philosophers throughout time and also discuss how the cinematography of the movie helps add to those ideas.
Today our movie of discussion is Schindler's List, a movie that goes over the Holocaust and one businessman who ended up saving 1,100 people.
Just a quick synopsis of some stuff. First, we're going to talk a little bit about the cast. You've got Oscar Schindler, played by Liam Neeson.
You have Amon Goeth, played by Ralph Fiennes.
Ishak Stern, played by Ben Kingsley.
Emily Schindler, played by Caroline Goodall.
And Helen Hirsch, played by Embeth Davids.
Some of the philosophies we'll be keeping in mind for this presentation is Locke, whose idea of natural liberty of man is to be free, and Machiavelli and his idea of a tyrannical leader.
Some cinematography techniques we'll be discussing include the rule of thirds, how they use music to set the tone of certain scenes, as well as color symbolism.
We have one review here to kind of show the general consensus of the movie. From Rotten Tomatoes, it states, the film's epic sweep and grasp of detail are exemplary, while some scenes could even make a lump of granite weep. This is Spielberg's most grown-up film.
So before we dive into some of the characters and philosophy and stuff, we want to talk a little bit about the historical background. This is a World War II movie and it takes place during the Holocaust. So the majority of the movie takes place in the Plaszow concentration camp near Krakow, Poland. And the movie itself begins with the relocation of Polish Jews to the ghetto, and then later on in the movie they move from the ghetto to the concentration camp in the fall of 1939.
And with that, this is the very breakout of World War II.
Right.
And so that's why the Jews were just starting to be incarcerated by the Nazis.
And because this was just the beginning of the Holocaust, they weren't being killed in mass exterminations quite yet. They were just being used as quick and easy, cheap slave labor.
Yeah, most of the labor they're doing was hard physical labor too. It was metalworking, construction, factory jobs, as we see in the movie.
And speaking of factory jobs, Schindler's List, it's based off of a true story. There was a man, Oscar Schindler, who ran a factory in Plaszow, and he was just hoping to get cheap, quick labor like most businessmen at that time. But then because of his experiences and working with such close proximity to the Jews, he begins to develop a sympathy for them, and he wants to work to set them free.
He used war as a basis to get a job, but he ended up changing because of it.
Exactly. So while we're on the topic of Oscar Schindler, he's played by Liam Neeson, and as we said, starts out as a selfish businessman, and then develops a sympathy for these Jews after seeing, one, a mass shooting at the Krakow ghetto of the Jews.
Along with the mass burnings of the bodies and the ash in the air.
And these two experiences were enough to change his entire mindset about the Jews. He was a member of the Nazi Party, and so he went to great risks to his own safety and reputation to keep these people safe. And eventually he bankrupts himself by buying all of his workers and saying, these people are under my jurisdiction, you can't hurt them without me pressing charges or anything.
Yeah, and he bribed other Nazi officers to leave him alone, to let him take the Jews to his factory to work. And that further sent him towards bankruptcy, all to protect the Jews.
And even with all these great personal sacrifices that he made, the payoff was well worth it, because in the end, he saved over 1,100 Jews from being murdered.
That's 1,100 Jews that would have been taken to Auschwitz if it wasn't for him.
And one of the great parts about this character is the emotion that he conveys. As you said, he's played by Liam Neeson. And Liam Neeson, normally he's in action movies. He was in Star Wars, he's in the Dark Knight trilogy, he's in Taken, but this is definitely one of his more serious roles,
Yeah. Instead of taking an action-based role, he takes more of a political business role, a higher up, so to say.
Definitely. So now what we're going to do is talk a little bit about the philosophy behind Schindler. And what we're going to do is, I personally think he definitely relates to John Locke. One of Locke's big ideas is the natural liberty of man is to be free from any superior power on earth and to not be under the will or legislative authority of man, but to have only the law of nature for his rule.
And Schindler, he definitely felt the same way because he saw the oppression of the Jews by the Nazis, and he felt their freedom shouldn't have been taken like that, so he decided to step out and help them.
Exactly.
And through the movie, that leads up to this revelation for him, he develops from that self-centered man, like we mentioned before, and he becomes the savior for and for all these Jews.
And even just from, the Jews were essentially in slavery, and Locke was very anti-slavery, anti-war, and by the end of the movie, Schindler also definitely has these ideas.
He felt no one should be able to take your rights.
Exactly.
Yeah, we see Schindler, same thing, same.
Now, in media, there's oftentimes foil characters. You've got the good character and the bad character, and they exist to highlight each other's differences. And Schindler is very much the good guy in this movie, and so the foil to him is Amon Goeth, played by Ralph Fiennes. He's the main villain. He's the one who oversees the Plazow concentration camp. He's supposed to, represent he is the physical manifestation,
the cruelness of Nazis.
Exactly. He is the Nazi Party as it is to the Plazow Jews.
And normally in a Holocaust movie, you'd expect Hitler himself to be the main villain, because he's the one everyone knows. But instead, we see a leader of the army instead.
Exactly. And I think by doing that, it shows the scale. He was just a commanding officer of the army, and he had all of these people under his control. Think about how many other different commanding officers were in charge of however many other people, and that just gives you a bigger sense of how big and how bad the Holocaust really was.
Yeah, and we see some of these horrible things that he takes part in with ordering random killings of the Jews, like a random lady who tried to protest and help save a construction building, had shot on the spot. And we also see him taking leisurely time on his balcony with no shirt on, just shooting random Jews that he
however he saw fit, And they definitely do this to show, the apathy and the contempt that the Nazis had towards the Jews, and specifically, they don't care what they did to them; they just didn't want them around.
Yeah, just like how any person nowadays might golf, other random hobbies. His hobby was shooting Jews.
Yeah, and I think one definitely really interesting thing about his character is, despite being a member of the Nazi Party and killing so many people, he actually had an affection for his handmaid, who happened to be a Jewish girl. He liked her, and he would try to save her in multiple different ways.
Because he didn't have her wear the Star of David to mark her as a Jew, so that way other officers might not have thought of her as a Jew and could get away with keeping her.
And then when Schindler tried to go to him and say, "I'm buying, your handmaid," Ammon wouldn't.
He wouldn't let him have her.
Yeah.
He had some connection to her, and he wanted to kind of get in the way of Schindler. And it wasn't until Schindler raised the price he was going to pay for her to about
14,000.
Yeah, 14,000 German marks. That's when he finally gave him to her, or her to him.
And then, as we see at the end of the movie, after the fall of the Nazis, he's hung by the Russians for his crimes against humanity.
Yeah, and he stayed loyal German Nazi to the end. He, as he was being hung, he said "Heil Hitler" and went out. He
was definitely a really good bad guy. That's the thing about movies. If you've got a really good bad guy, you don't want to sympathize with them, but you can respect that they make him.
You respect the evilness.
If you hate the villain, that means they do a good job.
Yes. And
he's like that in some other movies. He was Voldemort in Harry Potter.
A very, very influential movie that is known worldwide.
And there's even some parallels you can draw there between Voldemort and his army and how they would blindly follow him.
And the Nazis blindly hating the Jews.
Right. Aside from villain characters, he was also in the Grand Budapest Hotel as one of the main characters, Monsieur Gustave H.
Yeah. And now the philosophy we're going to tie with Amon is Machiavelli and his idea of the tyrannical rulers, as we said before. Machiavelli's idea was that, in his eyes, he should establish himself on that which is in his own control and not in that of others. He must endeavor only to avoid hatred.
So essentially what Machiavelli is saying is a good leader, he should be hated, he should be feared.
He should be feared,
not hated, because being hated to Machiavelli meant that could be the potential for an uprising to happen. And he didn't want that to happen because, if there was a revolution or an uprising, that's overthrowing this tyrannical leader.
Yeah. And this slightly goes off from Machiavelli's idea because he was definitely hated by the Jews.
Oh, yeah. Goethe was the person that they could pin all the blame and hate to.
Yes. But despite this, the Jews, they had nothing they could do. They were powerless, they were weak. Some of them tried, but didn't turn out well.
Yeah. that's the way that he does stray from Machiavelli, but Machiavelli believed that there should be one leader who has ultimate power over whatever group, and in the Plazow concentration camp, that one figure was Gove.
Yeah, no one dared disrespect him, go against him.
Definitely. And with these both ideas of Locke and Machiavelli and how they relate to the two main characters, you can get that with dialogue, sure, but a lot of the other ways they do that include the cinematography. And I think one of the most notable things that they do is they use certain camera tricks or certain like how they frame the scenes.
The certain shots they choose.
Certain shots in order to show how different German high society is compared to the Jews, who were definitely the lowest class of the low at this time.
They were treated as pests, vermin that need to be destroyed.
And this is apparent right from the very beginning of the film. They've got, at the very beginning of the movie, you've got Schindler along with a whole bunch of other members of the Nazi party.
Having a heck of a time.
They're at a party. They've got booze, there's dancing, there's attractive women, and they're all having a great time. And then it immediately jumps to the Jews being relocated to
the ghetto. Yeah. They're driven from their homes and forced to live in cramped rooms with people they didn't even know.
Exactly. Another good way that they show the
kind of separation between the Jews and the Germans.
Exactly. This is apparent in the first conversation which Schindler and Stern have, where they play it with the rule of thirds. You've got Schindler is on the right side and Stern's on the left. And as they talk back and forth, the camera focuses on Stern, focuses on Schindler, right?
Yeah, and they come across as mostly even kind of in their conversation. But then when Schindler pulls ahead in the conversation and kind of forces Stern into working with him, you see Schindler take up a majority of the frame, as opposed to Stern still taking up his third of the frame.
Exactly, and this is done to show, even though in this conversation they were being mostly civil, there was still that different power structure between Schindler and Stern.
There's the idea that Schindler was above Stern.
And another way that they show Schindler as being above the Jews in his still, kind of jerky businessman type phase is after he's evicted a wealthy Jewish family from their home, he flops down onto their bed and he says, this couldn't be better. He's very satisfied and content with his living situations.
But that same family that was driven from their home is then forced into a ghetto with other people in one small room. And the man's wife states, it could be worse.
And then, of course, her husband says, how could this be worse?
Small room, cramped, nothing good.
And then a little bit of comedic relief that they do is they have a large Jewish family come in through the door, and they greet each of them individually, greets the husband and wife, and right after he says, how could this be worse? How could this be more cramped? A large family comes in and makes it even more cramped.
It's worse.
They play it off as a little bit of humorous in the movie, but that's just the situations of all of the Jewish families at that time.
Yes.
Another great thing which they do is they use music, and music in any movie can really play with your emotions. It can be used to set the tone of different scenes, and the music in this movie is great. It was John Williams composed it.
Which, as we know, he's composed Star Wars, Jurassic Park,
Indiana Jones,
Jaws,
and E.T.
Yeah. And who can't love John Williams' music?
Right. His music is great, and
classic.
Let's use Star Wars as an example. Star Wars would not be as iconic as it is without when you hear that main fanfare or like Darth Vader's theme, you instantly know, oh, that's a recognizable piece of music.
Music can make or break a movie sometimes.
Exactly, and it definitely makes the movie in this one. To start, during one scene when they're burning the bodies, this is the one which Schindler witnesses, which is one of his changing experiences. There's a choir that's singing during this, and as opposed to an orchestrated piece of music. And I think that they do that because this choir, they sound like remorseful and almost sad. At
Very somber tone.
Exactly, at the situation that's happening, and they can't do anything about it.
And it helps show just kind of the hopelessness, the tragedy of this whole scene. And then in the movie, music isn't just, it's not bound to just the soundtrack and background that characters can't hear. We also have music that's actually physically there.
Right, like there's one scene as the Nazis are going and throughout the ghetto and are exterminating the Jews, there's one part where there's a Nazi soldier who's just playing at a piano while all of this horror is happening around him. You hear screams, you see muzzle flashes on the sides of the walls, gunshots.
And
but he's just playing along,
and
having
his
a grand old time.
his fellow soldiers are behind him, and they're just debating on what he's playing, whether it's Mozart, Bach.
Exactly, and again, they do this to show how the Nazis didn't care what would happen to the Jews. They
How
were just
apathetic they were to their situation.
Exactly.
In a similar situation that happens again in the concentration camps this time, when we have the Jews, they're all forced to strip and run around as Nazis decide if they're fit enough to continue work or if they're going to Auschwitz.
Right.
And meanwhile, we have these happy tunes playing on the speaker.
Over a loudspeaker.
Yeah. And this isn't a happy scene. Their life's being decided right here. But this shows the Nazis, they didn't care. They played happy music.
Yeah, and then I think the last definitely big thing of cinematography that they do is they use color symbolism.
Definitely.
So this movie's all in black and white, and even though this was made in the '90s when there was definitely color movies, I think they did this to give it a more sense of historical value.
Kind of comes across as like more Nazi films.
Exactly, almost like a propaganda movie from during wartime.
Mm-hmm.
But there are a few instances where there is color. One of these is a little girl in a red coat.
So, as you can see, this one girl, she's wearing a red coat, and that's the only scene, part of the clip that's in color. We just see her coat, and everything else is in black and white still.
And I think the reason, especially to make it a little girl, is because, when you're a kid, you've got your whole life ahead of you. You can make your own future, do whatever you want. You're full of innocence and full of hope, especially.
Yeah.
And then, as we see later on in the movie, she's one of the main... as they're burning the bodies, you see them pushing a cart along the bodies.
You see her coat shining out in color amidst the black and white bodies that are all sitting there.
And Schindler's right there too. He's seeing this little girl in her little red coat being dragged along to be disposed of.
And the girl, she stands out to the audience because she's wearing the red coat, so we easily see her. But Schindler takes an interest in seeing her. He's watching her as she moves through the town and notices her body. And so it's kind of to show the little girl that Schindler's paying attention to.
Mm-hmm. The Holocaust was impersonal. It didn't care who it took. It just wanted the numbers. And, they killed children and, anybody. But especially by killing children, it's showing that this was a dark time. There was almost no hope for these Jews, They knew that once they got to a certain point, they were going to be killed one way or another.
And this one bit of color was that one flicker of hope throughout that gets silenced.
But then as the movie progresses, it seems darker and darker. But then eventually, there's a sort of gradual build up to the final scene. Mm-hmm. And just right here, we have a picture of
Schindler's
List. And he and Stern sat down and he typed up a list of all of their workers that he had.
From memory, naming them off to Stern to write down.
Yep, and then he would ask Stern, okay, how many names are we at here? And he'd be like, oh, we are at 100, 200, and Schindler would be saying, all right, we need to get more. We can't stop until we have all of the workers.
Kept saying more, kept going.
Right, and all this build-up culminates into about the last half hour or so of the movie. We learn that the war has ended, and that Schindler says to them, in 5 minutes, you will, something along these lines.
Midnight, I think.
At midnight, you will be free, and I'll be a wanted man.
Because he helped these Jews.
But he was still a member of the Nazi Party.
And the Russians wouldn't know that.
No. Although one part I do really like is when Stern hands him a letter, and he says, we've written this letter just in case you get captured, to hopefully explain the situation from our side, which shows that the Jews really cared. Mm-hmm. They really cared about Schindler.
And all of them signed that letter. Mm-hmm. And he was then we see the emotional vulnerability of Schindler as he's saved these 1,100 people. That's 1,100 lives that would have been snuffed out otherwise. But he looks at his card that's still there and states, why do I still have this? I could have sold it. I could have gotten 10 more people for that.
Right. I could have sold my Nazi pin, which was made of gold, and that could have been worth at least, I could have bought 1 or 2 more workers. I could have saved 1 or 2 more people.
Just one more he
exactly.
wanted.
Despite all the good that he's done, he gets hung up on, what if I had done more? What if there was more that I could have done to help these people?
And it was just that one more he wanted, and he saved 1,100 people. He was a savior to all of them and their next generations. thousands in total of lives that wouldn't have been there.
Exactly.
That he saved, but he wanted one more.
And one good way that they really show the scale of how many people Schindler saved is after he's left, and it's the next morning after they've been liberated. They're walking over to a town, hopefully to find some resources and get help starting their new lives. And we see a huge line of people all walking towards the camera, but then it starts to transition to color, and then we see that it's supposed to take place in modern time, it being the 90s. Yeah, but it takes place in modern time, and we actually see some of the survivors, like some of the Schindler Jews, as well as the actors who played their character. Yeah.
As they go to visit Schindler's physical grave in real life, and you see the whole line of them as they're backed up in the cemetery, all going to place a stone on the grave in memories.
Out of respect. And then this entire scene is in color. It's not just one red coat is in color. All of it is in color to show that these people were able to live their lives as well as their future generations.
And since color represented hope by that little girl's coat, instead, since it's all in color now, that kind of represents how they got their hope fulfilled. They're living the life they wanted, or should have had to begin with.
And then, it also says in the movie, there's some little text pop-ups, which it's kind of like a where are they now type thing. It talks about how Schindler bankrupted himself by buying all of his workers. A lot of his business ventures after the war failed because war profiteering was his main business.
Yeah, you also get with the war profiteering when he took the Jews to his new camp where they were safe from the Nazis. It was a weapons camp, ammunition camp, and he made sure that not a single bullet made there was actually used in war, could actually be fired.
And that's a very John Locke idea. Locke was not only anti-slavery, but he was also anti-war. And by the end of the movie, Schindler himself is also really anti-war because he would purposely he would have his workers sabotage their machines to make sure that none of their products were actually used to do any harm.
He would also buy other weapons from other companies and resell them to make sure that no more bullets were getting into the market for war.
Definitely.
And now, just for kind of our final bit, we have some reviews of other critics.
These all come from Rotten Tomatoes. One very positive review says, "It's a stunning achievement, a film that recreates a Holocaust, not as something abstract, but as felt knowledge." And I think that's really important, especially in this day and age of so much political division. We just need to remember, we're all human. We should all be working together for our collective good, and we need things like this movie to remind us that life used to be terrible for some people, and the amount of hatred that people are capable of, we need to remember that we never, ever should go back to something like that.
We need to remember what happened to make better choices for the future.
Exactly.
Another positive review that we have here is says, "With seemingly effortless grace and skill, Schindler's List balances fear and exultation, humor and horror, love and death, evokes superbly a time of savagery and grief, and the inexplicable, stunning compassion that rises within and against it." So, in this movie, there's moments of humor, but meanwhile, there's a definite grief. You can't deny that.
There's lots of great emotion from all of the actors. They really definitely play their characters well, and you even told me you cried a little bit when we watched it.
Yeah, it was sad at the end. There was some very tragic scenes. There
were. But then there's also, like the review says, there's those hopeful moments. As he's maybe writing his list, you can get the sense that these people are going to be okay. They're going to live, stuff like that.
And then we get that hopeful ending.
Now, despite being an overwhelmingly positive reviews, we struggled to find one negative review, but we still wanted to see what some negative opinions of this movie were. And this one says, "Despite admirable intentions and the undeniable splendor of his craft, ultimately what Spielberg has told is the story of the list. He has not told the story of Schindler." And personally, I disagree with this because we see Schindler's character development grow from, he was a businessman, he was a playboy, he was a womanizer, and then
he used war to get ahead too.
But then we see, his character change because of his experiences.
He sees these horrible events unfolding for the Jews.
Right.
And then he becomes the savior that rescued 1,100 people from death.
And then at the end of the movie, it also says, there were over 7,000 descendants of the Schindler Jews. And if those 1,100 people had been killed, that's 7,000 people who wouldn't have been alive.
Yeah. So there's some negative reviews to it, but it's mostly overwhelmingly
This is
positive.
a very powerful film about finding hope even in dark times, and that how humanity can rise above darkness to find good in anything. And that's our philosophy discussion for this week. We just want to leave you with one thought. This quote comes from Ishtak Stern in the movie. He says, "He who saves one life saves the world entire." And even if he had saved just one person, that's still one person who was able to live their entire life and to experience their world.
And so, to kind of honor Schindler and all this that happened, we want to make a toast to life.
A Hebrew toast which translates to life.
Yeah. L'chaim.